Sexuality has become more fluid for this generation, but masculinity is as rigid as ever.
All right, I am joined today by Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss, who is a professor at American University, where she is also the founding director and chief vision officer in the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, PERIL. Quite the name. And last year, she wrote and released Man Up, which is a book we are going to talk about quite a bit today. Dr. Miller-Idriss, thank you so much for joining me. And let me turn it over to you. Why don't you tell folks a little bit about your work and what you do at PERIL?
Thanks so much, Jonathan. And you have to call me Cynthia, please.
Okay.
I'm at PERIL, which is, I founded PERIL 6 years ago. We design, test, and then scale up tools to help people recognize and reject kind of propaganda, conspiracy theories, malinformation, harmful online content, and misogyny. So that cluster of things. And misogyny kind of got added to that rather belatedly, I will say. And I talk about this in the book because it was a blind spot for me, just like it is for a lot of other people in the field, in realizing how foundational it is to everything else. So once I wrote the book, we launched a whole portfolio of work on preventing gendered violence. And so we now have a much bigger team investigating these issues in ways that I hope will prevent those blind spots from being so strong in the future.
You know, we are talking, and it's 12 p.m. Pacific time on Tuesday, April 7th at the time of this recording. And I want to talk about those blind spots, but I think I would be remiss if I did not bring up what is happening in our country right now in this moment. We had, a post from the president this morning talking about ending a civilization, which is really the most extreme end of violent misogyny and violent extremism. So I do just want to give you the opportunity, if you have any particular thoughts about the work and the research you've done and how it comes to light in a moment like this and what it brings up for you.
Yeah, I mean, I today was watching the vice president, images of the vice president with Viktor Orban as well, talking about the need to defend Western civilization in that kind of conversation. And this is a guy, who attacked women's and gender studies first at the university, the Central European University, CEU, in Budapest, that was sort of chased out. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. A university in exile now in Austria. It exists in Vienna. I've been both to the university in Budapest, this beautiful old hundreds of year old campus, and now at basically a converted office building in Vienna. And that attack started on gender and on women and women's rights and the empowerment of women. And I think that's the kind of thing we're seeing now around the world, is that gender becomes a wedge to, and to attack women's rights, LGBTQ plus rights, and gender equity in general as a way of disempowering people. And it's a popular and effective tactic for authoritarian and autocratic leaders across the globe.
I mean, there's something to be said for, and I'm sure you have thoughts on this. They very rarely will name what they're doing as attacking gender rights and attacking gender equity. It's more so we're actually doing this to protect women or to protect children, whatever category you want to put there. In the Middle East, it's a great example of that, talking about them being oppressive regimes. How did they get away with that?
Yeah, well, a lot of the language of gender protectionism, which is sort of benevolent sexism, at its root, comes down to a set of beliefs that women should only be in certain kinds of roles, domestic roles, the pronatalist language, for example, that then is not met with, resources for the child once the child is there in the world, right? So, but women should be encouraged to have these babies, and so then they end up having to stay home because they don't have the income that can fund the child care, or they don't have the resources to support the parental leave, right, that they can't nurse as long as they want, or whatever it is. Even in the best of circumstances, those pronatalist policies result in women who have children stepping back from the workforce. So I think it's a defining of roles, it's a narrowing of roles under the guise of protection and of promotion of pronatalist policies, of babies, of fertility, of feminine sides, right? You get that kind of stuff as well. So it can sometimes sound appealing and positive, but also is met with reduction in reproductive rights, reduction in contraceptive rights, reduction in the ability to work, or to the promotion of sort of one household, one vote policies that favor men being in charge of the household's decision making.
One other question on this, and then I want to get back to what you brought up in your introduction, which is now when it comes to pointing out the hypocrisy of that, when it comes to kind of breaking the spell that those kind of policies can have on people, is there any information? Have you seen any research on this? Have you done research on this? What is the best way to help explain that to people? Is it tackling the ideas? Is it approaching it from like a back end or a different perspective? How do we get people to identify the hypocrisy within that for themselves?
Yeah, I think the most effective thing I've seen is to point out the tactics themselves that are manipulative. So what tactics are being used that make you feel somehow safer or more cared for, or like associate positive feelings with something that ultimately is also going to remove your own rights or reduce rights or disempower people, right? So that's a manipulative tactic. It makes you feel kind of, like the world is overwhelming and it's impossible to manage all these things. And so a lot of this pronatalist content, for example, in online contexts, can lend itself to kind of feeling like it's an anti-capitalist as well, right? So it can be kind of like couched in a sort of, I don't want this hustle culture. I'm just going to retreat to my soft life. But that soft life kind of language can very clearly bleed quickly into like, I'm going to be a kept wife, right? And then that kept wife,
right? You very quickly end up in the trad wife
So
territory.
so yep. you get into this like rabbit hole of stuff. And so I think the thing to recognize first is like, who's benefiting from this? Who's selling me something that might not be in my own interest? A profiteer, a manipulator, an influencer, or a politician who's seeking a vote in ways that might undermine the things you believe in and the values that you hold yourself accountable for. So I think that because it can feel really persuasive when you're talking about people who are feeling exhausted, stretched, overburdened by systems that aren't working for them, to think the solution is a return to traditional family values and these roles that are going to give us really clear guidelines on complementarism or something, instead of challenging the systems that aren't working.
Right. It's funny what that brings up for me. There's something that we talk about a lot in some of this red pill deprogramming, and it's men never want to feel like a stooge. So always get them to ask the question, who benefits when you believe the thing they're telling you? Right. And that's how we find opportunity.
Totally. We find that's especially true for teenagers. Teenage boys really don't like to find out they're being manipulated, and the research shows that they actually change their behaviors. Their behavioral choices change faster and last longer when you point out manipulation that's selling them something that's not in their best interest, whether that's fast food advertisements or propaganda from a terrorist group, than it does if you try to counter argue with them. Like, facts don't work in this context because people their sense of autonomy digs in. They're afraid you're trying to change what they think. We're not trying to change what people think. We want to teach them how to think and how to be more skeptical of content.
That's a great point and takeaway right there. And I'm hoping everybody listening is scribbling that down. That's wonderful. So, but I want to get back to the book because you did bring up something I want to talk about from the outset here. It's a fantastic read. I really do want to encourage everyone to check it out. I'll put a link in the caption. But, you talk about this, you talked about it in the introduction here. You talk about it in the introduction of the book. This was a book that, if it's fair for me to say this, you had a little bit of hesitation towards coming to write. Yeah. And there's hesitancy even within the world of academia, within the academy, within media, within policymakers that have held us back from connecting the dots that your book does. And I'm curious, could you talk about perhaps why that's existed for so long?
So I talk a lot about these silos that exist in the fields that come together in some sort of intersection of Venn diagrams around gender, feminism, women's studies, but also gender-based violence, domestic and intimate partner violence, and then national security, particularly around incels, but male supremacist kind of subsets of the manosphere that are advocating for violence or responsible for it. All of those things together, one of the things I, argue in the book is that are all foundational to the trajectories toward mass violence when we see that, mass shooters in the US, for example, over half of mass shootings, one of the targets of the mass shooting was a lover or a spouse or a partner of the perpetrator, right? That 60% of mass attackers in the US have a documented history of domestic and intimate partner violence. But those kinds of data points are not really talked about in meetings around how to prevent terrorism, or they're not really talked about in meetings around engaging in violence prevention work against women and children in domestic contexts. And then the women's and gender studies folks are often ensconced in kind of like humanities or social science fields that are a little bit more removed from the applied sides anyway. So for me, I'm a sociologist by training, but I've always been in an applied field, like in education or public policy. But I had not taken, maybe I took one women's studies course as an undergrad, but like I did not feel that it was my place to step up and have this conversation. I didn't feel like an expert in this part of the field. I could talk about youth, online youth cultures, what they're encountering. And so I was really, I just felt like unqualified, really. I was like, who am I to say this stuff? There are plenty of people saying these things. But the problem is, and including a lot of Black feminists who've been saying it for decades. But so I thought like maybe I can elevate some of that work, consolidate it, and show the sweeping set of tactics that are involved here in looking at the whole range of things, from exploitation to the most ordinary kinds of ways that misogyny creeps into our life, including in the gender policing of boys and men. So that was the goal, is to like end the role of white women and upholding all of it. So I felt like maybe after a while I started realizing like people are not paying enough attention, even though the writing is out there, that, the expertise is there. And so given that I have a little bit of a platform, I talk in the media sometimes, I write for the public, like maybe there's still a place for me to say something. So I was reluctant. People had been saying, you should write a book like this. I would talk about gender on panels. And I thought like somebody else who's really an expert should be the one to write it. But I love what you say. To do it.
Yeah, no, and we appreciate you. It's work that we need. And I also appreciate the perspective you have of asking yourself and saying, before I go do this, can I uplift the work, especially of the Black women feminists who have been doing this for so long? Because especially we as white people, but especially white men, I end up in a lot of rooms of men talking about this work, and they act like they're the ones who discovered the problem. Right. And it's like, no, please, those who we have oppressed have been talking about this for decades. We just haven't been paying attention to the problem. So I love hearing you say that. It's so important. So I want to start off with the importance of language. One thing I love, I have it circled here in the book on page 25. You write, patriarchies are built on two pillars: a set of attitudes, beliefs, and ideas that rationalize and justify hierarchies of superiority and inferiority, sexism, and a constellation of processes that enforce patriarchal norms and expectations, misogyny. Now, I think a lot of us, especially online, we see those three words, patriarchy, sexism, and misogyny, used interchangeably. Yes. So could you define them? Can you tell us, A, is that a problem? And B, can you define those terms as you use them?
Yeah, I think it's a huge problem that they're used interchangeably because they're not the same thing. And also the colloquial definitions, particularly of misogyny, mess us up in thinking about how best to intervene. So patriarchy is a system of power distribution. That's what it is. It's like a social structure. It's a system that's out there like capitalism, like anything else, right? It's a system of power distribution, and it's unequal power distribution between men and women, and it rests and requires the gender binary, which is one of the reasons why the disruption to the gender binary is so threatening to the patriarchal order, right? So you've got that. And then it rests on a set of beliefs and a set of actions, right? So you need beliefs that uphold it, and you need actions that police it, right? That enforce it. Otherwise, it's just beliefs without enforcement, or it's enforcement without the beliefs. You need both of those. So sexism itself is the belief that men and women are inherently unequal in some way, and so therefore deserve that unequal distribution of power or resources. And misogyny is the policing of the gendered norms and expectations that uphold those patriarchal systems. So men and women in particular have their place and have to adhere to these gendered norms and expectations. And the reason why I really like that definition of misogyny, which comes from Kate Manne, the philosopher, is that it's not the hatred of women, which is its colloquial usage, but it's the law enforcement arm of the patriarchy. And that means that women do it as well as men, and it means that boys and men are affected by it as well as girls and women. And once you start seeing the law enforcement arm of the patriarchy as including the homophobic bullying that boys experience, right, in this extraordinarily rigid system of masculinity that boys and men face, that kind of gender policing is a big part of trajectories to violence. And the experience of violence that comes from, I mean, that's what Bell Hooks said from the beginning, right? Is like the first thing that happens in patriarchies is the violence that men and boys enact upon themselves, right?
Right.
And so, and that's part of it. That's that misogyny. And so I think, you know, girls and women suffer more from the violence, but boys and men also suffer at the hands of other boys and men. And that's what a patriarchal system does. And I think cloaking, you know, sort of dismissing it as just hatred of women, which matters, but it just narrows that too much. And it makes too many excuses for like, well, I couldn't possibly be misogynistic. I love my wife, right? I couldn't,
Right.
I love my daughters, right? Like I'm
Right.
not a misogynist,
The equivalent of the
right?
I have a black friend
Yes,
argument.
right, exactly. But but we all do it, right? We all, everyone does it. And I think that's the thing. You have to constantly, it's an everyday way of policing in unconscious ways what boys and girls should be and do and what men and women should be and do. And that kind of belittling or, dismissiveness or talking over in the most ordinary terms, containment, right? Keeping women in their place, keeping LGBTQ people in the closet, right? All of those metaphors of containment that I talk about in one of those chapters are a really big part of that. And that opens up trajectories to some of that violence that happens later.
And I think I want to make sure I have this rephrased perfectly. So misogyny is really any form of violence that upholds patriarchy and the distinct domination of one gender over the others.
Yeah, and it's like a gender, it's one gender over others and one type of gender. So like the alpha cis hetero male over others, right? And so over other men. So it's, that's the way the system of patriarchy is. Most men receive more power over, all women and some other men. And so, and misogyny is, I would say, violence is metaphorical as well as physical. So it includes things like lighter forms of policing, you would say, that include like belittling, demeaning, dismissing. So that's also a kind of policing, insistence that someone be submissive or demure or quiet or smile, right? You should smile, right? That you are supposed to be pleasing and submissive and adhere to these gendered norms and expectations about being more docile, let's say, as a woman, or deferential to men. And in addition to the sexist kind of ideas that say you don't understand things as well as men.
Let's talk a little bit about that gender policing and the role that men play in policing each other within that, and bring it to a Gen Z, Gen Alpha lens, because one of the things that you say in the book that stuck with me for a really long time, and I quite frankly can't stop thinking about, is on page 66, you talk about reframing homophobic bullying as gender policing. And to do so, you talk about data that says that basically being gay is much more accepted within younger generations. But the problem is the performance of a gay identity, because that goes against what it's supposed to be to perform being a man, and that gets met with harassment. I'm curious if you could elaborate on that, because I think that's a fascinating point.
I love this study so much, so I'm going to shout him out, Joel Middleman-Levin, who did this study that I cite, because it also changed the way I see this and think about it too, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it ever since, which is that he found that American high school boys increasingly accept same-sex relationships among their peers. Essentially, it's okay if boys have sex with other boys or men have sex with other men, as long as they're bro about it, essentially, right? Like, so you can't be effeminate or flamboyant, right? You still have to be masculine in these traditional ways. And what that says to me is that sexuality has become more fluid for this generation, but masculinity is as rigid as ever. And that, I think, is so fascinating. Like, who would have thought that like sexuality would become more fluid before masculinity lost its rigidity? Like, it's like masculinity is like the last hurrah of the patriarchy, right? Like it's just this insistence on it being so rigid. And I think we see that with girls too, like girls and women who have less power and less status in patriarchies, but more flexibility to express themselves on a broader range of what's considered acceptable femininity, right? Boys and men get more automatic power and status, not universally, but get, patriarchies benefit them more in that sense, although harm them too. But are stuck in this incredibly rigid masculine, what some call the man box or man box culture of dominance and aggression as hallmarks of masculinity, of not asking for help, of not crying, of manning up, right? And all of that is really constantly policed. I mean, I've interviewed boys and men my whole life, and this is one of the things they talk about is like, I had a 16-year-old boy tell me, I asked him, what do you think that adults don't know about what it is to be a boy your age? And he said, without missing a beat, I don't think people realize what it's like to suddenly see that the world sees you as dangerous, to suddenly realize the world sees you as dangerous. And, another guy told me that like he spent his teenage years surviving the homophobic bullying of his peers, only to pop out like in his 20s and be told that's toxic, right? Like, and he's like,
after I've suffered it.
Like, my survival strategy is now toxic masculinity. Like, come on, what was I supposed to do? You cut these pieces of yourself off to survive the homophobic bullying of your peers, because you learn very quickly, starting at age like 4 or 5, the research shows, that you're not supposed to paint your nails, you're not supposed to cry, you're not supposed to have long hair, you're not allowed these expressions of vulnerability, you're not allowed to show emotion, right? Like that, you learn to be stoic, to lose your intimate friendships, as Niobe Way's research has shown around early adolescence, right? All of these things get lost, and society's sort of taken that away from boys. And then for some of them who are struggling to get back to connection, to vulnerability, to empathy, to caregiving, to this broader human range of capacities that were sliced off as survival strategy, they struggle with feeling like the world sees them as dangerous or toxic or bad, inherently bad. And so it's a dynamic that has to change, right? We can't, that's at the root of so much domestic intimate partner violence, and at the root of so much of the trajectory to mass violence and the grievances against women that we hear in anti-feminist spaces online.
Whose responsibility or who is best positioned to help those men walk that path? Because I think that's a question we see a lot, especially online, people saying, I don't want to help anymore. And I think that's a very valid reaction to have, but we can't do this work alone.
Yeah, I mean, I think the work that you're doing in online spaces is phenomenal, right? Like in short form video, and men's wellness and health organizations and boys, we're seeing increasingly national strategies for men's and boys' wellness show up. Like in Canada, we're seeing states like Maryland and California in the US create statewide strategies to address these sort of challenges that men and boys face. So I think you need some policy levers to push. You also need wellness and men's wellness groups that are focused on health and healthy styles and trajectories toward adulthood, like Movember or Next Gen Men, these groups that are kind of working on that. And you need groups that are working with older men, like Mark Green's work on, Walking Talking Men, and, these sorts of just getting men together to take walks in Central Park in a way that shows them you can be vulnerable with each other, and you can bond with each other, and you can have empathy, and it doesn't mean a loss of your manhood, right? So there's all of that. I think that needs to happen on the, shoulder to shoulder level, on the interpersonal level, in the Discord servers, in the online gaming spaces and communities, in esports and online gaming too, in lots of places where young men congregate. There's so much good work happening on the intervention side, and among some teachers and schools who are struggling to know how to do this, but understand the need to do it. And then, of course, like, parents can play a role and also are sometimes not the right interlocutors of these conversations, right?
Well, they don't have the right relational kind of power or the right relational standing to do those things.
And they also sometimes are the ones enforcing those same boundaries, right? Their same rigidity, right? Because they may have grown up in a time, or they're religiously motivated, or they are, they believe in some way that this is what a boy should be. And so they might be the ones saying, don't be a sissy, or don't cry, or man up, or toughen up here. You need to toughen up a little. And so those same messages are often coming from parents and older relatives in ways that can be harmful. So it's not to say that parents can't do it. They really can. And we have a guide for parents, and I put a guide in the back of the book, an abridged version of that, called Not Just a Joke, Understanding and Preventing Gender and Sexuality-Based Bigotry, that offers tools and guidance for parents and teachers and mental health counselors and educators. But I think I can't think of anything more holistically needed in this sense than, have the policy levers, the education levers, the health levers, the parenting, and the peers who can do it as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think to your point, uplifting, I think it's Governor Westmore in Maryland, Governor Newsom out here in California, Governor Cox in Utah, all doing, say what you will about any of them on any other issue. They're all doing a lot of great work around men's health and men's wellness. I'm so glad you mentioned Walking, Talking Men. I lead the chapters out here in California. We're at 20 across the country now. It's so wonderful. And Mark and I always say, we're at a point where we want people to care about men 500 miles away, but they don't even know the guy who lives 500 feet away. And this is really helping to create, to your point, that shoulder-to-shoulder work. One other question I just want to ask around the Gen Z, Gen Alpha, but I think we all always believe that we are on this march towards progress and that the next generation will be more X, more Y, whatever that variable is than the one that came before it. But we've seen the studies, especially in the past few weeks, saying that Gen Z men actually fewer of them identify as feminists. They might have more regressive views on marital relationships than baby boomers. I'm asking you to hypothesize here, and maybe you do have a theory on this, but why do you think the numbers moved in that direction?
Yeah, so first let me just say something about the numbers, because it's both men and women, and Gen Z are, so it's like a third of Gen Z men now say across 29 countries, data just released from King's College saying that a third of Gen Z men agree with this statement that wives should always listen to their husband and men should have the final say in household decisions. So that's double what boomer men said. So it's 16% of boomer men, and I think it's 33% or 34% of Gen Z men. But the data on women is 18% of Gen Z women and 6% of boomer women. So it's triple the growth on that. Some of that is as Gen Z men and women age into marriages and relationships, will they start to see that that didn't work that well, and so maybe they start to change their opinions? That's one. So some claim that this is a generational phenomenon, developmentally rather, than a phenomenon that means that this generation is fundamentally different. I don't believe that. I think there could be some developmental shift, a few percentage points, as people age and they get parents and they become parents and they have to care for aging parents, and they start to realize this double shift burden isn't really working, and so they may rethink some of those thoughts that they had when they were younger. But I think a lot of what we're seeing is driven by online worlds that are isolating and polarizing men from women, that are creating incredible lack of understanding, and that are deeply populated with gendered grievance narratives that are directed at the other. And so there's a ton of grievance narratives directed against women online for being transactional in the dating world, or being devious, or just false narratives that are not statistically true, but that nonetheless position women in ways that are fueled, have a lot of grievances attached. And those are linked to, searches for self-help and searches, and concerns around isolation and disengagement. So that kind of cluster of things is driving a lot of feeling among young men that what they really need is to be back on top.
I'm glad you mentioned women in your answer to that question, because in the book, you identify the 5 strategies that misogyny uses to reinforce patriarchy, and they are containment, punishment, exploitation, erasure, and enablement. I'll ask you to introduce them all for folks in a second, but I just want to talk about enablement specifically first. I'm going to ask you to define it, but I also want to ask you a question, which is, we were originally supposed to talk on April 3rd, which was a day after Pam Bondi had been ousted by President Trump. It was a few weeks after Secretary Noem had been ousted. The first 2 dominoes to fall on this administration were the women who were uplifting it. So is that really kind of the perfect example of the false promise of enablement?
It is a good example. I mean, I think it's that what you see with a lot of in particular, looking at white women's role here at the intersection, when I look at it in the book, is the intersection of white supremacy and movements that enable white supremacy and white women's role in them, particularly through the lens of motherhood. And not only white supremacy, also sort of adjacent things like the trad wife movement, which can get exploited by white supremacists, but is not exclusively white supremacist. So, I think it's important to point that out. And things like QAnon moms, right? I look at. It's no surprise. I mean, I have worked with a bunch of formers over the course of the last 10 or 15 years, which are former extremists, including several who are women. And one of the things you find is that women often enter extremist movements because of a lover or a partner. So they're kind of swept up in following or persuaded often by, or marry into it or are raised in it. So I know a number, of women who are born into like neo-Nazi groups, but they leave because of the misogyny. And so it's really interesting. Like they pretty soon find out that they're not actually immune from the violence and hatred that comes from men. And here I just want to say, like, one thing that I opened the conclusion to the book with is a conversation I had with a funder at one point while I was writing the book, who works in a context, it's a German funder who works in a context in which combating anti-Semitism is sort of the crux of the fight against white supremacy. And so he said, misogyny, but that doesn't have anything to do with white supremacist extremism. And he said, I mean, it's not as if these guys want to eliminate women from the face of the earth. And, it made me realize, like, I have to articulate more clearly, why elimination is not the only problem. So, right, like, it's not just elimination from the face of the earth, because, yes, these guys do need women, white women, to repopulate the fantasy of a white, ethno-state. But, like, suppression, exploitation, punishment, right? All of these, the violence enacted against women, sexual assault, like all of that is still systematically part of the problem and provably leads to trajectories to mass violence in ways that show we can engage and interrupt earlier. So, it's white women's roles, and it's also the view of white women by these movements that I think plays a significant role in mobilizing and supporting and enabling.
I'm so glad you said that, because I think what happens so much is we all expect the next villain to look like the last one, but it's going to look differently. That generation's Nazis won't look like these. They've learned it's going to look different. And that your point about just because they don't want to eradicate all women, no, that's not enough. That's not what it's supposed to be.
It was really interesting though. Like that's how you learn what you have to articulate more, right?
Right,
so I was
right,
like, okay,
absolutely.
This is really interesting. Like you think, and of course, like if you work on anti-Semitism in Germany, yes, the final solution is the thing you're most driven by, thinking about the Holocaust. But there were also brothels like run by the Nazis in the concentration camps too, right? Like, so there were conversion, forced conversion practices, like with, that required women to be raped by gay men, right? Like there were all kinds of things happening in there that involved gender and sexuality and exploitation that intersected with the operational and financial gains like that the Nazis made, including keeping their soldiers happy with these brothels. And so, I think thinking about these things as intersecting and supporting one another is really essential. That white supremacy is buttressed by misogyny and vice versa. It's like an ideological glue.
Yeah, I really appreciated the conversation you had in the book about the brothels and prostitution within concentration camps. As I'm the grandchild of a survivor, it was an area of that I had no idea about, and I went down this whole rabbit hole researching that. So thank you for sharing all of that. Yeah. I want to ask.
Very well discussed.
No, not at all.
Very much.
Even when I've been to camps, I don't think I saw signs about it or anything.
The exploitation of women is often, even today, like in the Charlottesville trials. One of the things I learned after I wrote the book was the Charlottesville trials, which were trials for the Unite the Right rally, dozens and dozens of neo-Nazis on trial there. Apparently, I learned afterward that every single one of them had a documented history of domestic violence on the criminal side, had a criminal record of domestic violence. But it was only used in the trials to describe their bad character. right? Like these are just bad guys, right? And so I think the brothels got treated that way also. Like these are just bad guys. But in some cases, the systematic habits of exploitation of women are supports to these movements, right? They're financing themselves with it. They're recruiting soldiers with it. We know that about Islamist groups, right? We talk about the Yazidi women, the Nigerian schoolgirls, sexual violence of Hamas, right? All the time, nationally, globally. We don't talk about it when it's white supremacist groups running prostitution rings, even though they're doing it here too.
You know, with enablement, is that a part of your work you get noticeably more pushback on when you try to discuss it than others, just because it's not the other anymore? It's now, oh, I have to look at myself and what role I might be playing.
You know, you'd think so, but like interestingly enough, not so much. I think that I'm happy to be surprised. Yeah, I think it does. I think there's two things. One, the fact that I talk about men and boys and their well-being so much in the book, or I emphasize it a lot when I talk about it. And then I also talk about the role of white women in enabling, right? It kind of, both of those things, I think help lend themselves to what I hope people walk away from hearing me or reading the book with, which is, this is not a finger wagging book, right? This is a, we are all
not
part
at all
of the problem book. And the problems are bigger than you think. It's not just this subset of bad actors who have bad character, you know, like in the Charlottesville trials, who are abusing women and then going on to conduct mass shootings. This is a culture that has enabled and supported this type of gender policing and you know, law enforcement arm of the patriarchy in ways that are sweeping, right, and exist in many different ways that allow us to make it more invisible. And so I think the fact that white women are so proactively involved in producing content like trad wife content that is, interestingly enough, subscribed to in some cases by a vast majority of subscribers being men, right? So this is also like fantasy content for men, right, rather than content to try to socialize women. That plays a role, a huge role, right?
Absolutely. Before we get off the topic of enablement and these strategies, I would love real quick if you could just briefly explain to people the other 4 strategies here of containment, sure, punishment, exploitation, and erasure.
Yeah, so I tried to think about like what's the wide range of things, and there's probably some that I missed here, but the 5 that I settled on are containment, which is the most ordinary expression of misogynistic policing, gender policing of girls, boys, men, women, everybody in between, that tries to keep people in their place, out of public view, keep them contained back in the kitchen, back in the closet, but also sort of expressions like lock her up, send them back, right? And all of the things in between, like the quiet piggy, the, you know, dehumanization through slurs, right? That kind of try to remove power from people, and how that culture of containment, of keeping people in their place, creates pathways to finding an Andrew Tate or an influencer like that appealing, etc. So I talk about online gaming and memes and self-help searches in that chapter. Punishment, which was the you know, chapter that is probably the most recognizable to anybody who works in the national security field, is a chapter where I talk about like the worst of the manosphere, male supremacist subcultures online, incels who are involuntary celibates, who are misogynist. So not at their origin. Originally they were a self-help group created by a woman, but they quickly became a violent subculture that is misogynist, that targets both kind of alpha type men and women for not providing the affection, attention, sex that men feel they deserve, these men feel they deserve. And so they've been responsible for some 50 odd deaths in the US, but also the Toronto van attack and other attacks in other parts of the world. And so that's about punishment and about sort of anti-feminism and the removal of rights. And then exploitation, which was by far the hardest chapter for me to write, in part because I also didn't know that at all.
And I was going to say, conceptually, it was the hardest one for me to approach because it was very unfamiliar to me with a lot of the way you tied it all together.
What? I knew some things, like I remembered that there was a Vice headline that said, why are all the neo-Nazis getting arrested for child abuse, sexual abuse material? Like I remember that headline, and I remember thinking, you know, is there something in, you know, neo-Nazi white supremacist trajectories that is related to this power, abuse of power, right? The fact that we have such a high percentage of perpetrators of mass terrorism and shooting who are documented criminal domestic and intimate partner violence abusers. And then that doesn't even include things like stalking, harassment, sexual assault. So this whole chapter looks at that intersection of child exploitation, sexual exploitation, gender-based violence, and sex trafficking, which again was something I did not know, that a journalist turned over to me, this idea that, well documented now, anecdotally at least, that neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups are running, running prostitution rings and are using the financial profits from that to finance their racist operations. And, I just didn't know that. And so it was really hard to read that material, to analyze it, and to write about it. And then the chapter on enabling, which is about the role of white women. And finally, the chapter on the concluding chapter, which is where we get to solutions, where I hope people walk away with a little bit of hope.
Right. I think, did we cover Erasure just now? I think we may have missed that.
I skipped over. I erased Erasure. Yeah. Look at that. So Erasure, so important, and I erased it, is the chapter on
proving the point of why we got to talk about it.
So important to include because it's also often neglected in the arc of thinking about gender and gender policing. So here I look at the erasure of LGBTQ communities, both in terms of knowledge and the erasure of bodies. And so, really attacks on gender affirming care and anti-trans mobilization, but also curriculum, knowledge, the book banning, book burnings that we've seen, the mobilization of school board, librarians getting accused of being pedophiles for letting a 16-year-old take out a book that had same-sex partners in it. And then also how that contributed to the mobilization of neo-Nazi protests outside of Disney World, and Proud Boy protests at sort of drag story hour. And so the opportunistic violent mobilization alongside those deliberate erasure, which is part of the undermining of rights and the attempt to silence and remove from public view anybody who doesn't fit this gender binary.
I want to go back to something you were talking about before, which was the Charlottesville trials, and just talking about how we police and hold accountable for what's actually been done. In the book, you talk about a man in Cincinnati, a self-identified incel, who was the first person, or the first incel, sentenced to a hate crime for the violence they wanted to enact against women. I couldn't find any other examples of this, so I'm curious, do you know, were there any? And B, what role do you think that could play if we start pursuing these as hate crimes in potentially reducing the incidence of these crimes?
Yeah, what it would do is the same thing that I've argued around the sex trafficking problem. Like when you have neo-Nazi or white supremacist groups who are broken up on usually 3 charges, which is rings are broken up on 3 charges, the networks on racketeering, weapons trafficking, and drug trafficking. But the DEA says itself, where there's drug trafficking, there's sex trafficking. Those things almost always go hand in hand, and yet there's never any sex trafficking charges. And that's because you can't add sentencing years, by they're getting enough. They're getting these guys put away faster with these charges that are easier to prove. You don't have to rely on vulnerable witnesses, etc. But so one of the things I've talked to attorney generals about is could you add an enhancement charge, the way that we've had hate crime enhancement charges, so that it makes it visible. What it would do by treating misogyny as a hate crime, by treating sex trafficking as an enhancement charge when paired with either gang violence or some organized crime or white supremacist extremist crimes, you would get data that's visible instead of just anecdotal. First of all, you also might get local law enforcement to recognize a problem that I think is so often invisible and just treat it as a private problem or as a description of the bad character of the guys, right? So same thing with this data. And the journalist turned over this story from a state that I won't name, but he couldn't figure out how to keep the identity of the women safe, so he didn't end up reporting it, but he turned it over to me. I got to read the affidavits and his notes from the interviews, etc. And one of the affidavits is about the breakup of a neo-Nazi group in a small town, like not far away, and and it described in the affidavit that the neo-Nazi group, one of these guys, was described as having kept women for sale at a house, right? Having kept women at a sale for a house. And they were selling footage of their assaults on the dark web and using that to finance their racist activities. And again, no charges were filed, right? There's no evidence that any charges were filed for what they were doing to those women. And it's just used as a character description of what a bad guy he is. That infuriated me. It's the most angry I got while reading the book. 'Cause I thought, where's the justice for these women? Where's the visibility for the problem? And we're going to talk about, I talk all the time about terrorist financing on panels and groups. Like, we're not going to talk about this strategy of terrorist financing.
Right.
You're just going to talk about them like, selling some cryptocurrency or something. Like, it's just...
Is the impediment to this, is it the legal framework or is it the courage of prosecutors?
I think it's the legal framework isn't there. Prosecutors, I think it's totally invisible. So it's like, and maybe that's giving everybody too much credit, but it's like this, the way I describe it is like, when I talk about blind spots, I use it the way my generation talked about them in driving, which is like, that it's actually a spot that exists, and the only way to address it is to look over your shoulder and look straight at it, right? You have to look straight at the blind spot in order to see it. Otherwise, it's just there. It's not that it's like a lacuna or an absence, right? It's not a hole. It's like an actual blind spot that you can't see unless you look straight at it. And so I think that's what makes it invisible, is we're not looking at it. We look past it all the time. It just doesn't exist in our line of sight. And so part of it is making the invisible visible. Part of it is incentivizing with some hate crime enhancements or sex trafficking enhancements, local law enforcement to make that data visible and to make the crimes visible. And that requires some leadership on the part of attorney generals and also ways to protect the victims.
And is there anyone out there that's really actively championing for this to start happening, who's trying to put some pressure on to do that?
I think the state that is the furthest along at this intersection is Washington State. So where, they have an attorney general who's now the governor, who started a public health task force on preventing domestic violent extremism, I think is what the task force is called. It's a public health approach to preventing domestic violent extremism. That task force is the first time I've ever seen people at least pull together parties to be on the task force who include people from the domestic and intimate partner violence space. I also think that like Canada is doing a better job. I mean, there are countries that are doing a better job of this than the US, right? Where you have...
Unfortunately, the case on a lot of topics is right.
Yeah, exactly. But like where you have a better understanding at the national level and also at the regional level of, because of crises they've had in the past too, that gender-based violence and misogyny are part of the mobilization trajectory of violent extremists, and so there's more talk about that intersection happening.
I want to say thank you so much. This has been such a wonderful conversation. On a personal level, it's such a great add-on to the book. I hope everyone takes so much value out of listening to this. But the one thing I want to ask you before we wrap is that one of the things I really love about PERIL is that one of your values is optimism. And I think in a conversation as heavy as this one, in a book as heavy as this one, A, where do you find optimism? And B, what can you tell listeners that might give them some optimism after hearing this conversation?
Yeah, I'm an optimist by nature. Like, optimism was really important for me to have as one of those core values in the lab, and I'm really glad that the team agreed. So it's it was a collective endeavor to create those values. I think there's a couple different ways to look at it. One is if you start to see misogyny as not just something that comes from a few bad actors, but as a system-wide part of how we live our lives. It's in the culture, it's in the water. That you could see that as depressing, but you also could see that as, I see it as actually like helpful, because this means it's something that we can all engage in, right? Everybody has a role to play. So you can play a role if you're on the soccer team, you're a coach, or you're around the dinner table, you're an aunt or an uncle, right? You overhear somebody saying something, a peer, a teacher, a mental health counselor. Like, there's so many ways to intervene. And I think a lot of what makes people feel hopeless is when they lose faith that the systems or the institutions that they expect to help them make changes are not doing that. And so actually this puts kind of the reins in the hands of communities, of parents, of educators, of mental health counselors, of anybody who works with young people in particular to engage. And I think that's like a super optimistic frame of like, actually this can change. We can change this. We've seen it change now in the opposite direction through online cultures, but we can also work to change it back. And so I think that's one. And the second piece of optimism is, how I maintain hope and optimism is that I work every day with 30 people plus in my lab who are just out there like designing interventions and testing them and trying to scale them up. And we have so many great ideas with sports teams we're working with Hollywood scriptwriters we're working with, like just so many different, in arts, in culture, in sports, in media, with educators, with communities, with short form video. Like they're brilliant, and they're all half my age, or a lot younger. And that's amazing, right? So you get like this generational cultivation where my job is actually just to create opportunities for their ideas to shine. And I think, how lucky am I, right? Like that's an incredible, incredible thing to do in this phase of my career. And then the very last thing I'll say is like, I take hope from, I just came back from book tour. I give 50 talks like across 28 cities, absolutely intense, 6 countries. Almost everywhere I went, the first question, no matter who, like counterterrorism briefing, university settings, high schools, whatever, almost always the first question was from a parent. So a teacher in the room, a counterterrorism official. Parents come to the table, like they're worried, they're seeing what's happening to kids, particularly to boys. They're seeing these shifts. They want help. They want tangible, concrete suggestions for how to do this. And they want change. And kids too, like teenagers in high schools don't really want to live like this. They're not happy with what's happening in their online worlds and among their peers. And so I take a lot of optimism from the desire for change. And I think that, again, it's our goal in the lab and elsewhere to meet that desire with tools that are evidence-based and can help bring about change.
That's so well said, and a wonderful button on this conversation. Cynthia, thank you so much for your time today. The book is Man Up. It is a must read. Everyone, please check it out. I'll put a link in the captions. And Cynthia, just thank you for your knowledge. Thank you for your spirit. And thank you for the work you do. It's so important.
Thanks, Jonathan. And same with you. Thanks so much for what you're doing. I love following your posts, and I think you're going to make, it's already making such an impact. So really appreciate it.
Appreciate it. Thank you.